Hello, my name is Mr. Bradley, and I'm a contributing member of the famous Westwood High School World History team. I'm here to talk to you today about early religious beliefs and practices. I hope that your first couple of weeks of school has been good so far, as we're really starting to get into the thick of it. Please have your notebook handy and go ahead and turn to what we were working with last time, which is going to include the River Valley civilizations that we looked at in China, Egypt, and the Indus. And also for the homework that's due for today, which is Chapter 3, Section 2, Hinduism and Buddhism, their development, to explain the key terms and respond to some of the main idea questions that were at the end of that section. Let's look a little bit at these two religions here. And so we think about the origins of both Hinduism and Buddhism. Both are similar in that they are ways of liberating the soul from the illusions and disappointments and mistakes, and also the search for enlightenment. Both do have a set of sacred texts to support their teachings. And also both religions do provide some sort of moral law or a guide that things that you do will have an effect on you later on. Think about karma and reincarnation to achieve moksha, and the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path as a means to reach nirvana. One area they do differ, however, is they tended to reinforce, or Hinduism does tend to reinforce the caste system, as you kind of see what caste you are as the result of the deeds of the previous life. However, Buddhism did tend to reject the caste system. We'll take a quick pause right there, and I have a few Edpuzzle questions that I would like us to respond to before moving forward. One thing that we're going to do today is to look at the origins of Judaism. And so go ahead and turn to the next page of your notebook, and we can go ahead and put a title on there, The Origins of Judaism. And for the first main topic, we're just going to talk a little bit about the origins and background here. So ancient Canaan's location made it a cultural crossroads of the ancient world. By land, it connected Asia and Africa and two great empires, both eager to expand. To the east lay Assyria and Babylonia, and to the west, Egypt. Its seaports opened onto two most important waterways of that time, the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. The Israelites settled in Canaan, which lay between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. According to the Hebrew Bible, Canaan was the land God had promised to the Israelites. Most of what we know about early history of the Israelites is contained in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Jews called these books the Torah and considered them the most sacred writings in their tradition. Christians respect them as part of the Old Testament. In the Torah, God chose Abraham to be the father of the Jewish people. Abraham was a shepherd who lived in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. The book of Genesis tells that God commanded him to move his people to Canaan around 1800 BC. Abraham, his family, and their herds made their way to Canaan. Then around 1650 BC, the descendants of Abraham moved to Egypt. The Hebrew Bible tells how Abraham and his family migrated for many years from Mesopotamia to Canaan, to Egypt, and back to Canaan. All the while, God watched over them. Gods worshipped by people were often local and were associated with a specific place. Unlike the other groups around them, who were polytheists, the Israelites were monotheists. They prayed to only one God. Monotheism comes from the Greek words mono, meaning one, and theism, meaning God worship. The Israelites proclaimed that there was only one God. In their eyes, God had power over all peoples everywhere. To the Israelites, God was not a physical being, and no physical images were to be made of him. The Israelites asked God for protection from their enemies, just as other people prayed to their gods to defend them. According to the Hebrew Bible, God looked after the Israelites not so much because of ritual ceremonies and sacrifices, but because Abraham had promised to obey him. In return, God promised to protect Abraham and his descendants. This mutual promise between God and the founder of the Jewish people is called a covenant. Let's take a brief moment. There were a few important vocabulary words that popped up in that first little piece. I'm going to ask you to take a couple of moments to review these words and to explain their meanings. So we have the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, monotheistic, or one God, and covenant, a promise between God and the founder of the Jewish people, who is Abraham. We'll take a brief moment to respond to some Edpuzzle questions. Welcome back. The next topic that we're going to focus on is Moses and the Exodus. So we can go ahead and set up our next piece of our notes with the topic Moses and the Exodus. The Hebrew Bible says the Israelites migrated to Egypt because of a drought and the threat of famine. At first, the Israelites were given places of honor in the Egyptian kingdom. Later, however, they were forced into slavery. The Israelites fled Egypt, perhaps between the mid-1400s and late 1200s BC. Jews call this event the Exodus, and they remember it every year during the festival of Passover. The Torah says the man who led the Israelites out of slavery was Moses. And it is told that at the time of Moses' birth, the Egyptian Pharaoh felt threatened by the number of Israelites in Egypt. He thus ordered all Israelite male babies to be killed. Moses' mother hid her baby in the reeds along the banks of the Nile. There, an Egyptian princess found and adopted him. Though raised in luxury, he did not forget his Israelite birth. When God commanded him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he obeyed. While the Israelites were traveling across the Sinai Peninsula, Moses climbed up to the top of Mount Sinai to pray. The Hebrew Bible says he spoke with God, and when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he brought down 2 stone tablets on which God had written the 10 commandments. These commandments and other teachings that Moses delivered to his people became the basis for the civil and religious laws of Judaism. The Israelites believed that these laws formed a new covenant between God and the Israelites. God promised to protect them, and they promised to keep God's commandments. The Torah reports that the Israelites traveled for 40 years in the Sinai desert. Later, books of the Hebrew Bible tell of the Israelites after their migration. After the death of Moses, they returned to Canaan. The Israelites made a change from a nomadic tribal society and settled herders, farmers, and city dwellers. Their political, social, and cultural life was influenced by neighboring peoples, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Mesopotamians, and Minoans. We'll take a brief second for some more Edpuzzle questions. Next topic that we're going to focus on is the return to Canaan. When the Israelites arrived in Canaan, they were loosely organized into 12 tribes. These tribes lived in separate territories and were self-governing. In times of emergency, the Hebrew Bible tells that God would raise up judges. They would unite the tribes and provide judicial and military leadership during a crisis. In the course of time, God chose a series of judges, one of the most prominent of whom was a woman, Deborah. Deborah's leadership was unusual for an Israelite woman. The roles of men and women were quite separate in most ancient societies. Women could not officiate at religious ceremonies. In general, an Israelite woman's most important duty was to raise her children and to provide moral leadership for them. The 10 Commandments were a part of a code of laws delivered to Moses. The code included other rules regulating social and religious behavior. In some ways, this code resembled Hammurabi's code, with its statement, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. To Jews, this meant to pay restitution and emphasize God's mercy. The code was later interpreted by religious teachers called prophets. These interpretations tended to emphasize greater equality before the law than did other codes of the time. The prophets constantly urged the Jews to stay true to their covenant with God. The prophets taught that the Jews had a duty to worship God and to live justly with one another. The goal was a moral life in accordance with God's laws. The emphasis on right conduct and the worship of one God is called ethical monotheism, a Jewish idea that has influenced human behavior for thousands of years through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We'll take a brief puzzle pause. Next topic we're going to be looking at here is the Kingdom of Israel. Canaan, the land that the Israelites believed had been promised them by God, combined largely harsh features such as arid desert, rocky wilderness, grassy hills, and the dry, hot valley of the Jordan River. Water was never plentiful, even when the numerous limestone formations soaked up any excess rainfall. After first settling in the south-central area of ancient Canaan, the Israelites expanded north and south. The judges occasionally pulled together the widely scattered tribes for a unified military effort. Nonetheless, the Philistines and other people in the area threatened the Israelites' position in ancient Canaan. The Israelites got along somewhat better with their Canaanite neighbors. From about 1020 to 922 BC, the Israelites united under three able kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. The new kingdom was called Israel. For 100 years, Israel enjoyed its greatest period of power and independence. Saul, the first of the three kings, was chosen largely because of his success in driving out the Philistines in the Central Hills. He is portrayed in the Hebrew Bible as a tragic man who was given bouts of jealousy. After his death, he was succeeded by his son-in-law, David. King David, an extremely popular leader, united the tribes, established Jerusalem as the capital, and founded a dynasty. About the year 962 BC, David was succeeded by his son Solomon. Solomon was the most powerful of the Israelite kings. He built a trading empire and beautified the capital city of Jerusalem. The crowning achievement of his extensive building program in Jerusalem was a great temple, which he built to glorify God. The temple was also a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the tablets of Moses' law. The temple that Solomon built was not large, but it gleamed like a precious gem. Bronze pillars stood at the temple's entrance. The temple was stone on the outside, while its inner walls were made of cedar covered in gold. The main hall was richly decorated with brass and gold. Solomon also built a royal palace, even more costly and more magnificent than the temple. Solomon's building projects required high taxes and badly strained the kingdom's finances. In addition, men were drafted to spend 1 month out of every three working on the temple. The expense and labor requirement caused much discontent. As a result, after Solomon's death, the Jews in the northern part of the kingdom, which was located far from the south, revolted. By 922 BC, the kingdom had divided into two. Israel was in the north and Judah was in the south. Eventually, the northern kingdom was destroyed and the only kingdom of Judah remained. As a result, Israelites became to be called Jews and their religion Judaism. For the next 200 years were a time of upheaval for the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Sometimes they fought each other, sometimes they joined together to fight common enemies. Each of the kingdoms had periods of prosperity followed by low periods of conflict and decline. The next topic we'll be looking at is the Babylonian captivity. Disaster finally struck as the two kingdoms lost their independence. In 738 BC, both Israel and Judah began paying tribute, or peace money paid by a weaker to a stronger power, Assyria. By paying tribute, Israel and Judah hoped to ensure that the mighty Assyrian Empire would not attack. But Israel revolted and withheld tribute, and in 725 BC, the Assyrians began a relentless siege on Samaria, the capital of Israel. In 722 BC, the whole northern kingdom had fallen to the Assyrians' ferocious assault. The southern kingdom of Judah resisted for another 150 years before it too was destroyed. The destruction of Judah was to come at the hands of the Babylonians. After conquering Israel, the Assyrians rapidly lost power to a rising Babylonian empire. The great Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, ran the Egyptians out of Syria and Judah, and he twice attacked Jerusalem. And finally, the city fell in 586 BC. Solomon's temple was destroyed in the Babylonian victory. Many of the survivors were exiled to Babylon. During the exile in Babylon, the Hebrew Bible describes how the prophet Ezekiel urged his people to keep their religion alive in a foreign land. Then about 50 years after the fall of Judah, another change in fortune occurred. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. And the next year, Cyrus allowed some 40,000 exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. However, many stayed in Babylonia. Work on the second temple was completed in 515 BC. The walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt in 445 BC, and soon, however, other empires dominated the region. First the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. These new empires would take control of both of Judah, and now called Judea, and the destiny of the Jewish people. And that will bring us to a good stopping point. We think about where we have been the last couple of weeks. Our first big unit on the Neolithic Revolution and of early civilizations. This would be a good time for us to take a bit of a pause and to assess our understanding of the content so far. So for next block, one thing that you're going to want to do is to look over your assignments in your notebook. Also to use the blueprint on Schoology to guide your focus. And then once you feel good with that, use the Quizlet available on Schoology to test your understanding. Thank you so much.